Hello everyone, and welcome back to Trail of Secrets. I know many of you use these videos to unwind or even fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. I was at the grocery store picking up a few things for dinner after a long day. The store was quiet, with only a handful of people moving through the aisles. It was late, close to 9:01 in the evening, and I had deliberately chosen this time because the store was usually less crowded. After gathering my items, I made my way to the checkout counter, tired but glad to be heading home soon. The cashier, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, gave me a polite nod as he started scanning my groceries. I watched him work, placing my items in bags with an efficiency that came from experience. The beeping of the scanner was the only sound between us, and I barely noticed when he paused for a moment, glancing up at me with an unreadable expression. I assumed he was distracted or perhaps just tired, much like I was. He continued scanning the rest of my items without a word, and I pulled out my wallet, ready to pay. It was an ordinary, uneventful transaction, until he handed me my receipt. His hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary as he passed it to me, and then he leaned slightly forward. His voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard him clearly. "Be careful," he said, his tone laced with an urgency that sent a chill down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" I asked, my voice coming out more startled than I intended. He didn't respond right away, only meeting my eyes for a brief second before looking away. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the interaction, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The store was quiet, and the other cashiers were busy with their own customers. "What do you mean?" I asked again, my voice quieter, this time almost hesitant. He shook his head slightly, avoiding my gaze as he began scanning the next customer's items. It was as if the moment had passed, and he didn't want to elaborate. I felt a surge of unease as I picked up my bags and moved toward the exit. His words played in my mind. Outside, the parking lot was dimly lit and a light drizzle had begun to fall. I walked briskly to my car, glancing over my shoulder more than once. The words, "be careful," echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was he warning me about something specific? Did he know something I didn't? Or was it just a harmless comment? Perhaps even a misunderstanding? The possibilities swirled in my mind as I unlocked my car and got inside, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the receipt in my hand. I turned it over, half expecting to find a note or some kind of clue scribbled on it, but there was nothing unusual. It was just a standard receipt with the list of items I had purchased and the total at the bottom. I felt foolish for letting it bother me so much, but there was something about the way he had said it, the urgency in his voice, that made it impossible to ignore. The drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. Every car that passed me on the road seemed to linger a moment too long, and every shadow along the sidewalk seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Home was my safe place, and I was eager to put the strange encounter behind me. I carried my groceries inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking that all the windows were secure. As I unpacked the bags, I couldn't help but glance out the window every few minutes, my mind still racing with possibilities. I told myself that I was overreacting, that the cashier's words were probably nothing more than a strange choice of phrase. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something more. I finished putting everything away and settled into my usual evening routine, trying to distract myself with television and the comfort of my familiar surroundings. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether I should go back to the store and ask the cashier what he meant, but the idea felt absurd. What would I say? That his words had unsettled me to the point of obsession? I knew I would sound ridiculous, and there was no guarantee he would even be working that day. Instead, I decided to let it go, convincing myself that it was nothing to worry about. But as the day went on, small things began to unnerve me. I noticed a car parked across the street from my house, one I hadn't seen before. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and it didn't seem to belong to any of my neighbors. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was someone visiting or perhaps just a coincidence. But as the hours passed, the car remained, and I started to feel uneasy. I tried to focus on other things, but my attention kept drifting back to the window where the car sat like an ominous presence. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a strange noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on gravel, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I went to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The car was still there, though its silhouette was barely visible under the dim streetlights. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the cashier's words had planted a seed of paranoia in my mind. But the feeling of unease was impossible to ignore. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any signs of something out of the ordinary. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with unsettling images. Shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, whispers that I couldn't quite make out, and the cashier's voice repeating those two words, "Be careful." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. As the days went on, the feeling of unease began to fade, though it never completely disappeared. I stopped noticing the car parked across the street, and the strange noises outside became easier to ignore. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such an unsettling experience. But every now and then, I would think back to that moment in the store, to the cashier's whispered warning, and I would wonder what he had meant. Was it a random comment, or had he seen something that I hadn't? I may never know, but the memory of his words will always linger, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest interactions can leave a lasting impact. Story 2. It started on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling mindlessly on my phone while the soft hum of the television filled the room. Out of nowhere, everything went dark. The lights blinked off, the TV shut down, and the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen ceased. For a moment I froze, caught off guard by the sudden silence. I checked my phone, and its screen was still lit, reassuring me that it wasn't a complete blackout in the area. The first thing I thought was that the outage might have been due to a tripped breaker or something wrong with the wiring. I got up using my phone's flashlight to navigate through the darkness. As I reached for the fuse box, a strange feeling settled in my chest, a deep unease I couldn't quite explain. The house felt different. The air was heavy, and the usual comforting warmth of my home had been replaced by an unsettling chill. I flipped the breakers one by one, but nothing changed. My house remained engulfed in darkness, yet the silence wasn't complete anymore. I could hear something, a faint tapping, like fingertips against glass. It was coming from the living room window. I turned slowly, my breath hitching. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to walk back into the living room. The curtains were drawn, but I could make out a vague shape standing just outside. My pulse pounded in my ears. Taking cautious steps forward, I hesitated before finally pulling the curtain aside. My stomach dropped. A face stared back at me, pale, expressionless, and completely unfamiliar. Its features were sharp, eyes hollow, yet somehow fixed directly on mine. The tapping stopped the instant I made eye contact. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering onto the hardwood floor. The figure outside didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Then, without warning, it grinned. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't a normal grin. It was stretched too wide, unnatural, like someone who didn't quite know how to smile properly. My legs felt like lead, but I managed to take another step back, gripping the edge of the couch for support. The power flickered back on. I spun around, momentarily blinded as the lights filled the room. When I turned back to the window, the figure was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Had I imagined it? I retrieved my phone with trembling hands and checked the time, 10:42 p.m. My notifications were normal. No strange messages, no missed calls. Trying to shake the unease, I convinced myself it was some trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. But as I prepared to go to bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The living room window was unlocked. Was certain I had locked it earlier. My hand shook as I latched it securely, double-checking every window and door in the house before finally retreating to my bedroom. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow suspicious. I kept my phone close, its screen dimly lighting the darkness. Sometime past midnight, a notification popped up. "I saw you." There was no sender. My heart stopped. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this some cruel prank? A hacker? My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to respond. Before I could decide, another message arrived. "You left your window unlocked." My breath hitched. A cold sweat formed on my skin. I wanted to believe it was some elaborate joke, but deep down I knew better. I wasn't alone. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I kept my lights on, checked my windows obsessively, and even considered calling the police. But what would I say? That someone or something had sent me cryptic messages? That I had seen a face outside my window? It wasn't exactly a crime. The messages stopped after a week. No strange figures appeared outside my window. Life slowly returned to normal, but the paranoia never fully faded. I still double-check my locks every night, and I avoid looking outside once it gets dark, because sometimes in the silence of the night I swear I can still hear it. The sound of tapping against the glass. Story 3. The storm had rolled in faster than expected. Heavy rain pounded against my windshield as I carefully navigated the winding back roads leading to my home. The trees on either side of the road bent under the force of the wind, their branches thrashing like desperate hands trying to grab hold of something. Lightning streaked across the sky, momentarily illuminating the darkness that had swallowed the night whole. I was alone on this road, at least I thought I was. The radio had lost signal miles ago, leaving only the rhythmic drumming of rain and the occasional growl of thunder to keep me company. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. The drive shouldn't have been this nerve-wracking, but something about this night felt off. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. My heart pounded in my chest as my car skidded to a stop, just inches away from the dark silhouette. The rain blurred my vision, making it hard to discern any details, but I could tell it was a man. Tall, unmoving, with his head tilted slightly to one side. For a moment, we just sat there staring at each other. My headlights cast an eerie glow on him, but his face was obscured by the shadows. I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Who the hell just stands in the middle of a deserted road during a storm? I honked my horn, expecting him to react, to move, to wave, to acknowledge my presence in some way. But he didn't. He remained completely still, his posture unnervingly rigid. A deep sense of unease settled in my stomach. I didn't want to get out of the car. I didn't even want to roll down the window. Every instinct screamed at me to put my foot on the gas and get the hell out of there. But before I could make a decision, the figure finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and pointed behind me. A chill ran down my spine. I swallowed hard, my breathing shallow. Against my better judgment, I turned my head to look through my rearview mirror. There was nothing there. I whipped my head back around, but the man was gone. The road ahead was empty, as if he had never been there at all. My pulse hammered in my ears as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it the storm playing tricks on my mind? I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. Without wasting another second, I pressed down on the gas and sped away, my tires kicking up water as I fled the unsettling encounter. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window, double-checking them twice. My clothes were soaked with sweat and my hands were trembling. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a hallucination brought on by stress, exhaustion, and the eerie atmosphere of the storm. But as I peeled off my wet jacket, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message. I hesitated before pulling it out, my fingers slick against the screen. My heart dropped when I saw the text. "Did you see him?" There was no number, no name, just those 3 words. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my stomach twist into knots. Was someone watching me? Had someone been following me all along? I didn't know what to do. I debated calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That I saw a strange man on the road and got a creepy text afterward? Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off my phone. That night, sleep refused to come. Every creak of my house, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, standing in the road, pointing at something only he could see. And somewhere, deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't over. The following morning, I forced myself to go about my usual routine, hoping that daylight would bring some sense of normalcy. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. But just as I was beginning to relax, I noticed something outside. Footprints. They trailed from my driveway to my front door, muddy and distinct. My stomach lurched. My heartbeat quickened. I hadn't had any visitors, and I certainly hadn't walked through mud myself. I cautiously stepped outside, my breath hitching as I followed the prints with my eyes. They didn't make sense. The footprints, they started at my door. Not from the road, not from the sidewalk, but from directly in front of my house, as if someone had appeared there out of nowhere. My chest tightened as I backed away, rushing, back inside and locking the door behind me. My phone remained powered off, but at that moment I wished I had left it on. I needed to know if another message was waiting for me. Hours passed. I refused to check my phone. I refused to look outside again. Night fell, and with it came a heavy silence that settled over my house like a suffocating blanket. I turned on every light, hoping to push away the creeping dread that had latched onto me since last night. Then, at exactly midnight, my doorbell rang. I stopped breathing. My body went rigid. The sound echoed through the empty house, unnatural in its clarity. My mind raced through every possibility. Who could it be at this hour? A lost traveler? A neighbor in need of help? Or was it him? I crept toward the peephole, my heart hammering in my chest. With shaking hands, I pressed my eye to the small glass circle. There was no one there. The street outside was empty. The porch was bare. The wind howled against the trees, and rain had begun to fall again, but there was no sign of anyone standing at my door. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it was just another trick of the storm. Maybe a branch had fallen against the house. Maybe I had imagined the sound. Then, as I turned away, my phone, still powered off, buzzed against the table. The screen flickered to life on its own. And there, glowing against the darkness, was a new message. Let me in. Story 4. It started with a sound. A faint tapping at my window. I lived alone on the 5th floor of an old apartment building. The window overlooked a quiet street, and there was no balcony, no ledge, just a sheer drop to the pavement below. So, when I heard the soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the glass at nearly 2 in the morning, my stomach clenched with unease. At first, I ignored it, convincing myself that it was just the wind or a tree branch, even though I knew full well that there were no trees near my window. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my head slowly toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. The blinds were down, shielding me from whatever was on the other side. My heart pounded as I debated whether to lift them or pretend I hadn't heard anything. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message. I grabbed it, my fingers trembling slightly. Why won't you look? My entire body went cold. The message had no name attached to it. No number. Just those 4 words. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was insistent now, almost impatient. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, creeping toward the window with slow, deliberate steps. My hand hovered over the blinds, hesitating. Then, in a single motion, I pulled them up. Nothing. Just the cityscape beyond the glass, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. The tapping had stopped. My reflection stared back at me, pale and shaken. Exhaled sharply, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. It was late, I was exhausted, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I set my phone down, climbed back into bed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. Just as I started to relax, my phone buzzed again. I saw you. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned my head back to the window. My reflection was smiling. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on, staring at the window, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The reflection was normal again, mirroring my every move as it should. By morning, I convinced myself that I must have imagined it. Sleep deprivation could do strange things to the mind. Maybe the message had been some kind of prank. Maybe I had dreamed it all. That evening, I told myself not to be afraid. I followed my usual routine: dinner, a shower, a little TV before bed. I checked the window multiple times. It was just a window, just glass. There was nothing to fear. And then, at exactly 2 a.m., my phone buzzed once more. Let me in. My body seized with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words blurred before my eyes. My fingers hovered over the screen, uncertain whether I should respond or throw my phone across the room. The tapping started again. Slow, deliberate. Tap. 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 I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take deep breaths. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. My phone buzzed again. Another message. I know you're awake. My heart pounded against my ribs. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned my head, muscles stiff with dread, and looked at the window. My reflection was still there. But it wasn't me. It was watching me, grinning, its eyes dark and empty, and then without me moving a muscle, it lifted its hand and knocked against the glass from the inside. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window, and I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing. My phone was beside me. The screen cracked, but no messages remained. Not a single one. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but deep down, I knew better. That night I left the apartment and checked into a motel across town. I wasn't taking any chances. I barely slept, afraid that I'd wake up to find my reflection waiting for me in the bathroom mirror. The next morning I went back to my apartment to gather my things. I had decided I was moving out. Whatever was in that apartment, whatever had been in that window, I wasn't going to stay and find out. As I packed, I forced myself to glance at the window one last time, hoping for closure, hoping to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. But when I looked, my reflection wasn't there. The glass was empty, and then my phone buzzed. You can't leave. The window's surface began to ripple, like a pool of black water, and slowly, a hand pressed against the glass from the inside. I didn't stay to see what would happen next. I ran, I never went back. Story number 5. The rain poured relentlessly as I drove down the winding mountain road, my headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that clung to the trees like ghostly tendrils. The trip had been unplanned, a last-minute decision to escape the city's chaos and find solitude in the cabin I had inherited from my late grandfather. But now, as the storm raged on, I regretted not checking the weather forecast before leaving. As I rounded a sharp bend, my tires skidded slightly on the slick pavement, my heart pounding in my chest. Then out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing before coming to a screeching halt just inches from the person. My breath caught in my throat as I peered through the rain-streaked windshield. It was a woman. Drenched and shivering, she stood motionless, her long dark hair plastered to her pale face. She wore an old-fashioned dress torn at the hem, her bare feet muddy from the road. I hesitated before rolling down the window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" I called out over the roar of the rain. For a long moment she didn't respond. Then slowly she nodded, Unease settled in my stomach as I unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in silently, water dripping onto the seat. Up close, she looked even more unsettling. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and held an emptiness that made my skin crawl. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the tension. "Where are you headed?" "Home," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. I nodded, though her vague answer did little to ease my nerves. Still, I couldn't leave her out there in the rain. I pulled back onto the road, stealing occasional glances at my strange passenger. She sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead. Minutes passed in silence before she spoke. Again. "You're going the wrong way." I frowned. "What do you mean? I haven't told you where I'm going." She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto mine. "You're going the wrong way," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. A shiver ran down my spine. "All right, where should I turn?" She lifted a pale hand and pointed ahead. "Keep driving." The road stretched endlessly, the rain only growing heavier. I followed her directions, my grip tightening on the wheel. Something about this didn't feel right, but I couldn't bring myself to ask more questions. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke again. "Stop here." I pulled over, the car idling, on the side of the road. We were in front of an old dilapidated house, its windows dark, its wooden exterior weathered and worn. A sense of dread settled over me. "This is your home?" I asked hesitantly. She nodded and reached for the door handle. Just before she stepped out, she turned back to me. "Thank you for the ride. Be careful on your way back." Then, without another word, she disappeared into the night. I watched the house for a moment, waiting to see if she would turn on a light, but nothing happened. An eerie silence settled around me, broken only by the rain. Uneasy, I put the car in reverse and turned back the way I came. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town that I decided to ask someone about the old house. The man behind the counter at the gas station gave me a puzzled look when I described it. "That house has been abandoned for decades," he said. "No one's lived there since the accident." "Accident?" I echoed, my stomach twisting. He nodded. "A young woman died there years ago, hit by a car on the road during a storm. Some folks say she still tries to find her way home." A chill ran through me as I realized what had just happened. My hands trembled as I reached for my keys, my mind replaying the drive. The woman's dark eyes, her cold presence. I never saw her again. But every time it rains, I remember her last words. "Be careful on your way back." Story number 6. The clock struck midnight as I made my way home from a friend's house. The air was cool, and a dense fog had started to creep across the quiet suburban streets. I had taken this route countless times before, but tonight, something felt different. The usual hum of distant traffic was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made me uneasy. As I turned onto my street, I noticed a figure standing under the streetlight near my driveway. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his posture rigid, his face obscured by the dim light. My heart pounded. I slowed my car, hesitating. Who was he, and why was he just standing there? The moment my headlights hit him, he turned his head slightly toward me, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A shiver ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, but I was frozen in place, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then he moved. Not in the way a normal person would, but in a sudden, jarring motion. 1 second he was standing still, and the next, he was closer, just outside the reach of my headlights. My breath hitched. I shifted into reverse, ready to back away, but before I could, my radio crackled to life, though it had been turned off. Static filled my car, then a voice, distorted, whispering, "Don't go home." My body went cold. I glanced back at the man, but he was gone. The streetlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the pavement. My house loomed in the distance, its windows dark, its front door slightly ajar. I had locked that door before leaving. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Had someone broken in? Was this a prank, or was something far more sinister at play? Slowly, cautiously, I pulled into my driveway, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension. As I stepped out of the car, the streetlight above me buzzed and flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached my front door, my keys trembling in my hand. I pushed the door open, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house was silent, the air inside unnaturally still. I reached for the light switch, but as soon as I flicked it on, the bulbs burst with a sharp pop, plunging me into darkness once more. A whisper, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching before me, the shadows seeming to shift and breathe. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Then the front door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through my veins. I reached for my phone, but the screen flickered and died in my hands. I was alone, trapped in my own house with something I couldn't see, something that whispered in the dark. I forced myself to move, inching toward the staircase. Maybe if I could get to my room, lock the door, and call for help, I could figure out what was happening. But as I placed my foot on the first step, the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, standing at the top of the stairs. It had no discernible features, just a void in the shape of a man, its head tilted as if watching me. My stomach twisted in terror. "Leave," it said, though its mouth never moved. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, yanking it open with all my strength. The moment I stepped outside, the street light above flickered back to life, and the heavy weight of oppression lifted from my chest. I stumbled onto my lawn, gasping for air. My house stood silent, the front door swaying slightly as if taunting me. I didn't go back in that night. Instead, I drove to a friend's place and stayed there until morning. When I returned the next day, everything was normal. The lights worked, my phone turned on, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if nothing had happened, except for one thing. On my answering machine, a single message had been recorded at exactly midnight. A whispering voice. My own voice. "Don't go home." The night stretched on as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding against my ribs. The road ahead remained empty, swallowed by the inky darkness of the forest. I checked my phone again, but there was no further message, just that chilling, "Terstin dear, you should have stopped." My fingers trembled as I tightened my grip. The idea of turning back crossed my mind, but the thought of facing that old woman again made my skin crawl. Instead, I pressed on, focusing on getting home as fast as possible. A few miles down the road, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. A car was approaching, its high beams glaring against the darkness. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was another traveler, someone I could flag down and ask if they had seen the woman too. But as the vehicle drew closer, a deep sense of unease settled in my chest. The headlights seemed off. They flickered erratically, growing brighter than normal before dimming completely, only to surge back to life. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to create some distance, but the car behind me matched my speed effortlessly. I switched lanes, so did it. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I couldn't make out the driver through the blinding lights, but an overwhelming sensation of being watched washed over me. Then the car did something that made my blood run cold. It vanished. One moment it was tailing me aggressively, and the next it simply wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering. My eyes darted to my mirrors, searching for any sign of it. Nothing. The road was as empty as before. I let out a shaky breath and eased my foot back onto the gas pedal. I needed to get home. Now. As I rounded a bend, my headlights revealed something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I barely had time to react. I stomped on the brakes, tires screeching against the pavement as the car skidded, to a halt mere inches from the person. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized who it was. The old woman. She was standing there, motionless, her arm once again raised, pointing directly at me. Her eyes glowed with that same eerie white light, her expression unreadable. My breath came in short gasps and my entire body screamed for me to drive, just drive. But I couldn't. Something held me frozen in place. Then, slowly, her lips moved. I couldn't hear her over the hammering of my heart, but I saw the words clearly. Form, it's too late. The words sent a jolt of terror through me. Too late for what? What did she mean? Then the air inside my car grew impossibly heavy. The temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The radio crackled to life on its own, static filling the silence before a distorted voice cut through. You should have stopped. I didn't wait to understand. My instincts took over as I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I spun the wheel. I maneuvered the car around her, never taking my eyes off her form in my rearview mirror. She didn't move, didn't flinch. But as I sped away, something else happened that nearly made my heart stop. The figure in my mirror shifted, her face twisted into something inhuman, her jaw stretching impossibly wide, a darkness swirling inside, her gaping mouth. Then, just like that, she disappeared. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, not daring to look back again. The moment I reached my driveway, I bolted from the car and locked the doors behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, but when I opened my messages, the strange text was gone. No trace of it ever existing. I barely slept that night. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak in the house felt like an omen. But morning came, and with it, a sliver of relief. Maybe it had all been some strange, sleep-deprived hallucination, or so I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. Because when I stepped outside later that day, I found something that turned my blood to ice. A single weathered piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper. Scrawled in shaky, almost illegible handwriting were 3 words. You were warned. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing white eyes staring at me, burning into my soul. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I went about my routine as usual, but the feeling of unease never left. As I sipped my coffee, my phone vibrated on the table. Another message. This time it was even more cryptic. You left me behind. My stomach dropped. I hadn't given anyone a ride. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. Was someone watching me? Had someone followed me home? I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I retraced my route from the night before, driving back down that lonely stretch of road. The morning light made everything seem ordinary, yet the memory of that woman lingered like a shadow in the corners of my mind. I pulled over at the spot where I'd seen her, stepping out hesitantly. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Then something caught my eye. A small, crumpled piece of fabric stuck between 2 tree roots. I reached down and picked it up. It was old, moth-eaten, and smelled of damp earth. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the fact that it matched the tattered clothes the woman had been wearing. Suddenly, a whisper carried through the trees. You shouldn't have come back. I spun around, my pulse skyrocketing. But there was no one there. I bolted back to my car, throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors. My breathing was ragged, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. Now. As I peeled away from the spot, my rearview mirror reflected something that made my blood run cold. She was sitting in my back seat. I slammed on the brakes, my body shaking violently as I turned to face the intruder, but the seat was empty. Nothing. Just my own reflection staring back at me, pale and terrified. That was the last time I ever drove down that road at night. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose me, but I still receive messages from an unknown number, always saying the same thing. You left me behind. And no matter how many times I change my number, block the messages, or try to forget, she always finds a way back. Story number 7. It started with a single knock. I had just settled into bed after a long day, the kind of exhaustion that makes your body sink into the mattress like a stone in water. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then came the knock, soft, deliberate, and just loud enough to stir me from the edge of sleep. At first I thought I imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes settling or the wind tapping against the window. But then it came again. 3 slow rhythmic knocks against my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart immediately picking up pace. My apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom unit, on the 2nd floor. There was no reason for anyone to be inside. I lived alone. Swallowing hard, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the door. The knob didn't move. There were no shadows underneath the frame. But the air felt different, charged, heavy, like a storm was about to break inside my walls. Hello? My voice barely carried beyond the room, hesitant and thick with fear. Silence answered me. Minutes passed. No more knocks, no movement, just the stillness pressing in on me. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks after a stressful day. But then, my phone vibrated, a text message. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. Don't open the door. My stomach twisted into knots. My eyes darted back to the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained still. An unmoving slab of wood that suddenly felt like the only thing separating me from something I didn't want to see. I wanted to dismiss the message as a prank. Someone had the wrong number. But deep inside, I knew that wasn't true. My number wasn't listed anywhere, and I hadn't given it out to anyone recently. For what felt like hours, I sat frozen, staring at the door, my breath shallow and uneven. Then, as if the universe wanted to confirm my worst fears, another knock came. This time softer, more insistent. I gripped my phone, fingers trembling as I typed back to the unknown number. Who is this? What do you mean? The reply came almost instantly. If you open the door, it won't be me anymore. A chill spread through my body, rooting me to the bed. My brain struggled to make sense of it. Was this someone I knew? Was I being watched? And what did they mean? It won't be me anymore. I stood, heart hammering against my ribs as I inched closer to the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. Then, scratching. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. Not random, but in a pattern. Almost like writing. I staggered, back gripping the phone like a lifeline. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, to get out of my apartment. But my feet wouldn't move. Fear had locked me in place. The phone buzzed again. It knows you're awake now. A whimper escaped my throat as I fought the urge to scream. My eyes flickered to my closet, the only other place in my room where someone could hide. Slowly, painfully, I inched toward it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. With a shaking hand, I yanked the door open. Nothing. Empty hangers. Shoes lined neatly against the floor. No one there. A false sense of relief washed over me, but then another knock. This time, not from my bedroom door. From inside the closet, I stumbled backward, barely keeping myself from falling. My mind raced for an explanation, but none came. My phone vibrated one last time. If you let it in, you can't let it leave. I bolted for the front door. I didn't care if it was irrational, didn't care if I was losing my mind. I just needed to get out. But as my fingers wrapped around the doorknob, my body froze. The knocks had stopped. The apartment was silent again. But when I turned around, the closet door was open. Story number 8. It was a quiet evening when I first noticed something strange about my reflection. I had just finished washing my face, standing in front of the mirror, when I caught a glimpse of something off. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. My reflection mimicked my every move, but there was a delay, a fraction of a second where it seemed to hesitate, as if it was unsure of what to do next. I leaned closer, staring into my own eyes. They looked normal, but the longer I held my gaze, the more unsettling it became. A chill ran down my spine. Telling myself I was just imagining things, I turned off the bathroom light and went to bed, pushing the uneasy feeling aside. The next morning I woke up groggy and made my way to the bathroom. As I splashed water on my face, I hesitated before looking up. My reflection was there, just as it should be. I sighed in relief, laughing at myself for getting worked up over nothing. Days passed, and I began to forget about the incident. That was until one evening when I caught my reflection smiling. The problem was I wasn't. I froze. The expression on my reflection's face was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. My lips had remained still, yet the mirror showed a faint, eerie smirk. I swallowed hard, refusing to let fear take hold. Slowly, I reached out to touch the mirror, expecting the cool surface beneath my fingertips. It was there, solid and real. My reflection matched my movements once again, the smirk gone as if it had never been there to begin with. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore the growing unease, but the incidents continued. Sometimes, I would catch my reflection staring at me when I wasn't looking directly at it. Other times, I would move away from the mirror only to see a flicker of movement after I had already turned away. One night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I covered the mirror in my bedroom with a thick blanket before going to sleep. I told myself it was childish, but the relief I felt was undeniable. That relief, however, was short-lived. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, a faint whisper so soft I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay still, straining my ears in the silence. Then, I heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. A voice, low, murmuring, coming from the direction of the covered mirror. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pull the blanket over my head and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But my curiosity, or perhaps my fear, got the best of me. Slowly, I sat up and reached for the lamp on my nightstand, hesitating before turning it on. The soft glow barely illuminated the room, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I turned toward the mirror. The blanket was still in place, unmoved. But the whispering, it hadn't stopped. With trembling hands, I gripped the edge of the fabric and pulled it away in one swift motion. The mirror was empty. Not empty in the way a normal mirror would be when there was nothing in front of it. No, it was pitch black, like a void stretching endlessly beyond the glass. My reflection was nowhere to be seen. My breath caught in my throat. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I couldn't move. Then, out of the darkness, a hand emerged. It wasn't mine. The fingers pressed against the glass from the other side, leaving smudges as they dragged downward. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp. The room plunged into darkness again. I scrambled to turn the light back on, and when I did, the mirror was normal. My reflection was there, staring back at me, wide-eyed and terrified, just as I was. But something was different. A single fingerprint remained on the glass, right where the other hand had been. From that night on, I avoided mirrors as much as possible. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, mimicking my every move until the moment it wouldn't have to anymore. And when that moment comes, I don't know who will be on this side of the mirror and who will be on the other. Story number 9. It started on a cold evening, the kind where the wind howls against the windows and the darkness outside feels heavier than usual. I had just finished dinner and was settling in for a quiet night when my phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something about the persistent vibration made me reach for it. "Hello?" I said cautiously. At first there was silence, long enough that I almost hung up. Then a whisper came through, the line so faint I could barely make it out. "Don't go outside." A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, but there was only static before the call disconnected. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Prank call, I told myself. Just some kid messing around. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I locked the doors and double-checked the windows, telling myself I was just being paranoid. An hour passed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the glass. I tried to focus on the television, but my mind kept drifting back to the call. Just as I started to relax, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Who is this? The same whisper, barely audible. Don't. Go. Outside. I jumped to my feet, my hands shaking. If this is a joke, it's not funny. Static filled the line. Then something worse, a sound like someone breathing, slow and deliberate. I hung up, my heart hammering in my chest. A moment later, a knock sounded at my front door. I froze. It was soft, almost hesitant. I swallowed hard, stepping toward the peephole. The porch light cast long shadows, but there was no one there. Another knock, more insistent this time. I backed away. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to answer, but my hands moved on their own. Don't look, the whisper warned. A cold sweat broke over my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore the warning, to check outside, to make sure there wasn't someone playing tricks on me. But something about that voice, something unnatural, held me frozen in place. Then, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the room. My breath hitched and I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. The moment I switched it on, my phone buzzed once more. This time there was no whisper, just a picture. A picture of my front door, taken from outside. I dropped the phone and scrambled, backward. My hands were trembling too hard to dial 911. I was alone in complete darkness with something, or someone, just beyond the door. The doorknob rattled. I bit back a scream. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The knocking, the rattling, even the wind outside seemed to die down. For a long moment, I stayed frozen in place, barely breathing. Then, my phone buzzed one last time. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what message waited for me, but my shaking hands picked it up anyway. Next time, the whisper said, I won't warn you. Story number 10. It started on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling mindlessly on my phone while the soft hum of the television filled the room. Out of nowhere, everything went dark. The lights blinked off, the TV shut down, and the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen ceased. For a moment I froze, caught off guard by the sudden silence. I checked my phone and its screen was still lit, reassuring me that it wasn't a complete blackout in the area. My first thought was that the outage might have been due to a tripped breaker or something wrong with the power lines. I sighed and stood up, making my way toward the circuit breaker panel in the hallway. As I reached for the flashlight on the shelf, my phone buzzed in my hand. A single message appeared on the screen. Don't move. My breath hitched in my throat. The number was unfamiliar, and the message had no context. A prank, maybe? But as I stared at the glowing screen, something about it unsettled me. I hesitated, glancing around the darkened room, my ears straining to catch any sound beyond my own breathing. A moment later, another message appeared. They're watching. I felt a cold chill spread through my body. My first instinct was to turn on the flashlight, but the message made me hesitate. Who was watching and from where? Slowly, I backed away from the hallway and toward the living room window. Outside, the street was eerily silent. The houses across the road were dark, their usual warm porch lights absent. The entire neighborhood seemed to be swallowed by the same blackout. But something felt wrong. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the dim outlines of my furniture, barely visible in the weak glow of my phone screen. My fingers trembled as I tapped out a response. Who is this? The reply came instantly. Hide, now. A sharp knock rattled the front door. I jumped, my heart pounding. The knock wasn't forceful, but it was deliberate. Slow, rhythmic. Whoever was outside wanted me to know they were there. I held my breath, frozen in place. Then, another knock, and another. I moved away from the window, my mind racing. If this was some kind of sick joke, it wasn't funny. I checked the locks, making sure the deadbolt was secure. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched out in the darkness. Then, from the back of the house, a faint creaking sound. I nearly dropped my phone. My house was old, and it made noises sometimes, but this was different. It was the sound of something moving, something inside. I turned toward the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where? If someone had broken in, I was trapped. My only options were to hide or confront whoever or whatever was in my home. Another creak. Closer this time. With shaking hands, I slowly lowered myself to the floor, moving toward the couch. My phone buzzed again. The message read, "Stay quiet." A shadow passed through the doorway at the end of the hall. I swallowed a scream. It was barely visible in the darkness, just a shifting mass of black against black. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was standing there, watching me. I held my breath, willing myself to become invisible. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a burglar? Some kind of intruder? But why the messages? How did they know what was happening inside my house? My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before I could type, a new message appeared. "It knows you're here." I didn't have time to process the words before the shadow moved. It rushed toward me with impossible speed, crossing the room in an instant. I scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp in my panic. The crash echoed through the house as I threw myself toward the nearest doorway, my pulse roaring in my ears. I barely made it to the closet before I felt something brush against my shoulder. It wasn't a hand, it wasn't anything human. It was cold, weightless, like a breath of air laced with ice. I slammed the closet door shut and pressed myself against the back wall, clutching my phone like a lifeline. My screen lit up again. "Don't breathe." The darkness outside the closet seemed to pulse, shifting like a living thing. I covered my mouth with both hands, desperate to muffle the sound of my ragged breathing. The air inside the closet was stifling, thick with the scent of old fabric and mothballs. Something moved outside the door, a slow, deliberate scrape against the wood. I squeezed my eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. Then, a whisper, right outside the door. My name. My stomach dropped. No one should know I was here. No one should know my name. I felt a tear slip down my cheek as the whisper came again, this time drawn out, lingering. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. My phone vibrated. The message was simple. Run. I didn't hesitate. I burst out of the closet, pushing past the unseen force in the room. The moment I moved, the entire house seemed to come alive. The shadows thickened, twisting unnaturally as I sprinted for the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my sweaty fingers slipping as I heard the thing behind me shift. Finally, the door gave way. I stumbled onto the porch, gasping in the cool night air. The street was still eerily silent, the blackout holding the neighborhood in its grip. I turned back, expecting to see whatever had been inside my house standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. Just darkness. My phone buzzed one last time. You got away. This time. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd imagined everything in a haze of fear and adrenaline. But deep down I knew the truth. It was still watching. Story number 11. It was supposed to be just another late-night drive home. I had taken this route dozens of times before, a long stretch of highway cutting through a dense forest. The road was quiet, barely any cars passing by at this hour. The soft hum of my tires against the asphalt was the only sound accompanying me through the darkness. As I drove, my headlights illuminated something ahead, an old woman standing by the side of the road. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her gray hair unkempt, and her face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. Something about her posture seemed off. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. As I got closer, she suddenly lifted her arm and pointed straight at me. My stomach tightened. Her eyes, glowing an unnatural shade of white, locked onto mine. Panic surged through me, and I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. As I sped past her, my rear-view mirror reflected an empty road. She was gone, completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine. Had I imagined her? A few miles later, I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, exhaustion playing with my mind. But then my phone lit up with a notification. You should have stopped. There was no sender. I nearly swerved off the road. My hands were trembling as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. My rational mind told me it was some kind of prank, a coincidence, maybe even a glitch in my phone. But deep down, I felt something else. A sinking, primal fear. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The road was still empty, but the air inside my car felt heavier, colder. The silence pressed against my ears, amplifying my heartbeat. I turned, on the radio, needing some noise, but all I got was static. No stations, just an eerie, crackling void. A cold sweat trickled down my back as I reached for my phone, but the screen was dark. Dead. That didn't make sense. It had been charged just minutes ago. I was almost home. Just a few more miles. Then my headlights flickered. The road ahead twisted into darkness, my lights sputtering like a candle in the wind. I slammed my palm against the dashboard, trying to keep calm. But the lights dimmed again before flaring back to full brightness. And that was when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road. I stomped on the brakes, tires screeching as my car fishtailed wildly. The old woman didn't flinch. She just stood there staring, pointing at me with that same skeletal hand. I squeezed my eyes shut for a split second, bracing for impact, but when I opened them, she was gone. My car skidded to a stop, the smell of burning rubber thick in the air. My breaths came fast and shallow, hands gripping the wheel so tightly. My knuckles were white. I didn't understand what was happening. It had to be stress, lack of sleep, something logical. It had to be. I forced myself to keep driving, forcing logic over the pounding dread in my chest. The road stretched ahead, empty once more. I turned onto my street, the familiar sight of my house giving me a sense of relief. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself. My phone buzzed suddenly, the screen lighting up despite being dead just moments ago. A new message appeared. Don't go inside. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes darted to the house. The porch light flickered. The curtains in the living room slightly parted as if someone had been watching me. I reached for the glove compartment, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the pocket knife I always kept there. My heart pounded as I stepped out of the car, scanning my surroundings. The night was silent, too silent. I took a cautious step toward the house, my keys clenched so tightly in my hand that they dug into my palm. My gut screamed at me to listen to the message, to get back in my car and leave. But this was my home. There was nothing inside that could hurt me, right? I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my weight. My fingers hovered over the doorknob when my phone buzzed again. I'm inside. The door creaked open on its own. A sharp breath caught in my throat. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Something inside me, some irrational compulsion, forced me to step inside. The house was dark. Too dark. The familiar hum of my refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, both absent. It was as if the entire place had been swallowed by a vacuum of silence. My phone lit up once more. Turn around. I whirled around just in time to see movement in the shadows. A figure, tall, looming, stood just beyond the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows. My breath hitched. The figure moved, stepping forward ever so slightly. The light caught its face. It was me, a perfect reflection. My same clothes, my same features, but the expression was wrong. Twisted, smiling. You should have stopped, it whispered. The world spun. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in my car,